Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to another deep dive into the mind-boggling situation that is the global economy. Today, we're talking about the Federal Reserve, the cornerstone of modern economic mismanagement. Now, before I go too deep into satire mode, let's get serious for a moment. Recently, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston President, Susan Collins, made optimistic noises about inflation eventually drifting back to the Fed's mythological 2% inflation target. According to Collins, we are on a strong trajectory to achieving this goal, but, and here's the kicker, there may be bumps along the way. Well, hold on to your hats, folks, because those bumps aren't pebbles. They're gigantic speed bumps, courtesy of misguided economic policies. Let's break it down, Collins' optimism versus reality. Collins' optimistic view that inflation is on track to return to 2% seems overly confident, if not outright detached from reality. Month-to-month data, volatile as it is, doesn't paint the same cheerful picture. Recent CPI data for October 2024 showed a 3.7% year-over-year increase, far above the Fed's aspirational 2%. Year after year, we've watched inflation fester like an open wound, wreaking havoc on the consumer's purchasing power, while policymakers sit around, applying metaphorical band-aids to a hemorrhaging economy. Sure, Collins notes that housing costs are a significant factor in core inflation, but let's not forget the bigger story. Housing inflation has been a long-standing issue, driven by a cocktail of flawed policies, supply chain disruptions, and yes, endless money printing during the low-interest rate era of the 2010s and early 2020s. And here's the irony, the very monetary stimulus that was supposed to revive growth post-2008 has now come full circle, smacking the system with the side effects of rising house prices and overall inflation. According to the latest data, median home prices in October 2024 hit $413,000, a 7% jump from the previous year. Wages aren't keeping up, leaving average American families gasping for air, their savings withering away in the face of unchecked inflation. Now, let's sit back and take in the contradictions here. The Fed spent the better part of the last few years pumping liquidity into the financial system, only to now face a brutal inflation spike, a fact that Collins seems to gloss over. Does she know something we don't? Or are we all just supposed to roll with it and trust the process? Let's talk about monetary policy for a moment. Collins reiterated that the Fed remains restrictive with monetary policy, keeping interest rates high for a prolonged period. She even suggested that a rate cut could be on the table in December, but only if data supports it. Well, here's the problem. How long can the US or the global economy endure restrictive monetary policies without serious side effects? Recent data from the Chicago Mercantile Index, CME, points toward a high probability of rate cuts as early as the first quarter of 2024, indicating the Fed itself may not even believe in its drawn-out tread-water strategy. Why? The signs of cracks are everywhere. Rising commercial real estate, CRE, defaults, triggered by higher rates, estimate losses of over $118 billion in the coming year. Ongoing bank failures, remember Silicon Valley Bank? The systemic risks from higher carrying costs are once again bubbling to the surface across both regional and international banks. Credit Suisse's collapse earlier this year sent shockwaves, leaving us all wondering how much longer the Fed can keep the system afloat before the next tsunami of defaults hits. As of October, corporate borrowing costs surged beyond their 15-year averages, peaking at 7.3% for high-yield bonds. Many corporations are feeling the heat, too, adding a new source of instability. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not sugarcoat it. We're in the middle of an economic experiment. High rates have strangled household debt, commercial investments, and banking stability, but they've done little to anchor inflation. Yet here we are, still clinging to the belief that things are fundamentally under control. What's really going on? The Fed's actions seem reminiscent of someone trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol, lots of sound and fury, but minimal real impact. If history has taught us anything, it's that central banks have an uncanny ability to create problems they later ineffectively scramble to solve. First, they let inflation run wild during the pandemic, throwing trillions of fiscal stimulus into the market at a time when global supply chains were effectively broken. Logistics freezes? No problem. Just pump more dollars into the system. What happened then? Global asset bubbles, supply bottlenecks, and rising commodity prices that the average consumer had to absorb. Here's an eye-opener. The M2 money supply ballooned from $15 trillion in 2019 to $22 trillion by late 2022, fueling an inflationary fuse that was sure to detonate. However, the Fed downplayed this at first, calling it transitory. A familiar term for something that turned out to be far more devastating. By the time we hit 9.1% inflation around June 2022, a 40-year high, did the Fed finally awaken to the chaos they had unleashed? Now Collins wants us to believe that this gross underestimation of inflation's staying power is under control thanks to their belated efforts. I'm not buying it. Let's take a recent example from Japan's central bank. The Bank of Japan raised rates in October 2023 reluctantly, for the first time in years, and within months, the yen's plunge against the dollar sent shockwaves through Asia's proxies. Sound familiar? Currency manipulations, aggressive policy missteps, and global spillover. It's all connected, a domino effect that the Fed and other central banks are barely keeping under wraps. This is the crux of the issue: central banking policies, for all their elegance and econometric models, often miss one key reality: the plight of the middle class. Blunt policies like high interest rates hurt the middle class disproportionately. Put simply, higher rates equal higher mortgage payments, more expensive car loans, credit card rates up or bouncing into the 20% range, and dwindling savings in a landscape where inflation eats away purchasing power. A joint study by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac suggested that homeownership is now falling, the American dream drifting further out of reach. Meanwhile, the continuing rise in rents, up nearly 6% year-over-year, hammers renters too. By any measure, the middle class finds itself squeezed from every direction. Little wonder personal consumption expenditures, often cited as key to fueling 70% of U.S. GDP, have shown signs of stalling. Studies show that consumer sentiment in October 2024 fell to a 10-month low, signaling bitterness in expectations. And yet, despite this, the Collins and Company parade onwards, singing the same lullabies of optimism. At this point, it's impossible to talk about global inflation without addressing China's economic condition. China's property market implosion shows us just how systemic risks can spill over across borders if we're not careful. China's real estate sector accounts for 30% of its GDP, and massive developer defaults, remember Evergrande, and sky-high vacancy rates have led to enormous debt burdens. Just last month, China posted its weakest growth in 3 decades, with its economy growing at just 4%. That's quite a slowdown considering their double-digit growth rates of years past. The spillover effect on commodities, raw materials trade, and manufacturing input costs globally is undeniable. And yet, many Western nations, especially the US, optimistically underestimate the influence of a slowed Chinese economy on the world's inflation dynamics. If housing inflation is a key driver in America's CPI staying elevated, how do Chinese supply chain disruptions and cost escalations further compound these inflationary pressures worldwide? It's a question no one in the halls of the Fed seems eager to answer publicly, but the logic isn't difficult. Susan Collins' remarks about being on a strong trajectory toward 2% inflation don't align with the evidence on the ground, or with recent history. Given the ongoing state of bloated real estate prices, surging borrowing costs, and further international risks, maybe it's time for policymakers to re-examine. Can a 2% target even be realistically achievable in such a complex economic climate? Or are we in for a prolonged period of higher for longer policies, a silent capitulation to a new paradigm of global inflationary pressures? From volatile data to policy measures that stifle growth and squeeze households further, the average middle-class family remains stuck in the crosshairs of this grand Federal Reserve experiment. In the end, the Fed seems lamentably behind the curve. The cost is borne by us, consumers, homeowners, small businesses, and the global economy. Whether or not Collins and her peers realize it, the world is growing increasingly impatient with vague promises of smoother economic paths ahead. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button.